My name is Bill Scher. I'm the Vice President of the Calvin Coolidge Presidential Library and Museum. Thank you all for being here. We have had 46 presidencies and 45 presidents. 8 of those presidents have died in office. So it's about 1 out of every 6. We haven't had that happen in 60 years. We haven't had a president leave office, which only happened 1 time, midterm in 49 years. So we haven't had this experience of mourning and transition in a long time. And every time that's happened, history has changed in a pretty significant way. We have this really weird system, the Constitution, by amendment, that we elect a backup, even though that person has almost no assigned responsibilities, save for breaking ties in the Senate. And through most of American history, that person has been picked for pretty crass political reasons. They haven't really been integral to the administration, and it's often an unknown what will happen when that person has to step into the office very suddenly and abruptly. Yet the system has worked. The American system continues, and I think there's a lot to learn from these experiences. I don't know if we have. I still don't think we have the other 2 panelists here, but I will tell you that if you read Lindsay Travinsky's book she edited, Mourning of the Presidents, if you read Michael Gerhardt's The Forgotten Presidents, and you read Nathan Masters' brand new book, Crooked, which is about the scandals of the 1920s that started in the Harding presidency, spilling over into the Coolidge presidency, your mind will be greatly expanded. You will know so much more about America, about the presidency, and particularly about the Coolidge presidency, which is what obviously our mission is all about. And none of the 3 books are, there are no door stoppers in there. They're all pretty taut. They're all really well written. They're all fun to read. And so I greatly recommend you dive into them after we're done with our discussion here. But I wanted to start with Nathan anyway, because he did write about this subject, which is directly relevant to Coolidge. So why don't I just start, Nathan, by asking you, because you're a public television host in Los Angeles. This is your first book. This is your first book. You do a show and a podcast that has nothing to do with Calvin Coolidge or Ward Harding or personal history whatsoever.
Right.
So what brought you to this subject in the first place?
Well, yeah. So most of my professional experience in history has been in Los Angeles, and so yes, the people who follow me for my show, the people who watch my show, they wondered the opposite question, like what is he doing writing a book about national politics? I guess I was looking for a challenge. I wanted to move out of my comfort zone, but I started writing this in 2019, and without betraying too much of my my personal politics, I wanted to find I wanted to write a nonfiction thriller, but I also wanted it to be really relevant to what was happening. Concerns about the rule of law and what role Congress can play in reining in a presidency that might be flouting norms and norms of conduct and laws. So I of course turned back 100 years to the Harding presidency, and the Harding presidency seems to have been plagued just as much, if not more so, than any other presidency by corruption scandal. I came across this story of Harry Doherty, who was his political mentor, close friend from Ohio Republican politics. And I thought Doherty was an interesting character, but then I came across the story of the United States senator who investigated him, a freshman, maverick senator, the Senate's original maverick, a man named Burton Wheeler, who got very close to uncovering the truth and then found himself in the legal crosshairs of the Justice Department. I thought that was a great story. But it just so happens that that Warren Harding's sudden death in August of 1923, and then Coolidge's assumption of the presidency, that is what really set the stage for this, what became an epic sort of no holds barred brawl between Harry Doherty, the Attorney General, and Senator Burton Wheeler.
So one of the things I really love about the book is, if you ever read a book about a scandal, it's often very hard to follow. There's a lot of names, a lot of places, a lot of dates. It's you feel like the crazy person on the blackboard with the flowcharts trying to make sense of it all.
Right.
And I think this particular case of the Harding scandals is particularly weird because you have overlapping scandals. It's not just Teapot Dome. It's also the Veterans Bureau. It's also all the things that Harry Doherty, the AG, had his fingers in. And I just think he did a very good job of sort of laying it out very carefully and establishing a very a narrative that you can navigate. But for the folks here who may not know the backstory, can you give us the summation of what was going on in the weeks leading up to Harding's death, and what did Calvin Coolidge have to do in the immediate aftermath of his death?
Right. So the weeks leading up to Harding's death, he actually spent on an ambitious transcontinental train trip to Washington, and then a boat trip up to Alaska and down to the California coast. His body was failing. I'm not sure that he was aware of it at the time, but his body was failing, and unfortunately, he was also the victim of some medical malpractice. The White House physician, the doctor he'd installed as the White House physician was a goateed homeopath from Ohio, who I think was friends with his father. Still, instead of using a stethoscope to listen to somebody's breathing, he actually just put his ear right up on the chest. He refused to use the stethoscope. He was not in good medical hands. But even as his body was failing, he was wrestling with these emerging corruption scandals within his administration. They hadn't become public yet, but he was hearing rumors that not all was right underneath his presidency. So yes, there's the Veterans Bureau scandal where people were taking advantage of funds meant for World War I veterans. There was the Teapot Dome scandal, which the Senate was just beginning to investigate, in which, of course, there were bribes for oil drilling rights. And then he heard what he called rumors of irregularities within the Justice Department. In fact, on this trip, he wanted to confide in this newspaper editor, William Allen White, didn't really get around to it. I think, maybe he couldn't trust White, but he did eventually pull Herbert Hoover, future president, and at that time, Commerce Secretary, aside, confided in him that he'd heard that Harry Doherty was up to no good. At least there were problems under Harry Doherty. And he spent most of the trip muttering about, what a president can do when his friends are false to him. It really seemed to weigh on him. And there's reason to speculate that had he survived, he might have taken action. He might have tried to clean up everything that was wrong in his presidency. But unfortunately, he died on August 2nd, 1923 in a San Francisco hotel room. And Calvin Coolidge, who was staying with his father in rural Vermont, he was roused from his sleep to hear the news and then to be sworn in as president. And of course, like as befits his character, he immediately went back to sleep after taking the oath of office. Of course, if he had known, if he had known about all of these scandals festering in his what was now the Coolidge administration, he probably couldn't have gone back to bed. But eventually they came out. Within a matter of months, they came out. And I don't think any president in American history, and maybe my co-panelists can correct me, but I don't think any president has inherited such a mess.
I do want to loop. I know we have Lindsay Travinsky on. I'm not sure if we have Michael Gerhardt on yet. If you are here, feel free to unmute and let me know. So I want to get to you, Lindsay, in just 1 second, but I just want to ask you one more question, Nathan, before I turn to her. Is it your sense that Calvin Coolidge handled this mess in a deft way that helped clean up the mess and put his administration on the right track? And or do you think he was actually tainted by the mess and had to engage in a cover-up to save himself?
It's a good question. I think the answer is complicated. You know, my personal take is that when it comes to the Teapot Dome scandal specifically, I believe Coolidge acquitted himself honorably. In fact, he was, you know, he was sort of handcuffed by Harry Doherty's continued tenure in the office of Attorney General. Harry Doherty, for whatever reason, refused to join the Senate in investigating Teapot Dome. You know, he refused to even open a case, or the Bureau of Investigation, at least, which was later became the FBI, was part of the Justice Department. It refused to even open a case file on the matter, even as the Senate and Senator Thomas Walsh was uncovering evidence that, you know, oil man E.L. Doheny had essentially bribed the Interior Secretary $100,000 in cash delivered in a black satchel by Doheny's son in return for rights to lucrative rights to an oil field. Even as that evidence was made public, Doherty refused to act. And Coolidge stepped in, and in what was maybe not an unprecedented, but certainly an unusual insertion of presidential power into the domain of lawyers and prosecutors, Coolidge essentially pushed Doherty aside from that matter and appointed two special counsel, one Democrat, one Republican, to get to the heart of the matter, to avoid these fraudulent oil deals and prosecute the principals in the scandal if evidence could be found of criminal activity. So in that case, he acquitted himself well. But you know, when it comes to Harry Doherty, you know, Doherty was sort of the American left's favorite villain during this time within the Harding administration. He was the subject of a lot of criticism, a lot, you know, some of it fair, some of it unfair. But there was an intense pressure on Calvin Coolidge to fire Harry Doherty. There were you know, credible rumors that there was wrongdoing in the Justice Department, and Coolidge would have been justified in dismissing him, but he felt an intense loyalty to his predecessor, not a personal loyalty. I think Coolidge and Harding were not close, but he felt that, you know, he was not, as an unelected president, he didn't have the sort of legitimacy that Harding did. And if Harding had appointed Harry Doherty, then Harry Doherty should stay in office. He should be given at least every chance to defend himself before the Senate committee. You know, Coolidge actually said it's a sound rule that when the president dies in office, it's the duty of his successor for the remainder of that term to maintain the counselors and policies of the deceased president. It's probably a controversial sentiment, but Coolidge, I mean, what I'll say is that I took away from this. I came away really impressed with Coolidge's commitment to hire principals, even at you know, the expense of his own political well-being. You know, he seemed to be, and this was part of his college education, he seemed to think that public service was one of the highest purposes in life, and he was willing to sacrifice political capital to do what he thought was right. Today, that, you know, from our perch 100 years later, that seems a little quaint, but I was impressed.
Well, thank you, Nathan. I think we have Michael on now. Yes?
Yes, I'm finally here.
I'm very sorry for the delay. I will get to you in just a second. We haven't heard from Lindsay yet, so I'm going to bring her in now. So, Lindsay, you edited this fantastic book, Mourning the Presidents, which covers a number, not just presidents who died in office, but also presidents who died out of office and what the country went through in those situations. You don't cover Coolidge. We won't fault you for that. But we do want to get your perspective on how the Coolidge experience compares to some other times when the president died in office. You know, Nathan said no one really had the same kind of mess that Coolidge was inherited. Do you have a different take? Is there a presidency that had a big mess, or are there other aspects of the Harding-Coolidge transition which have parallels to other things that happened in the past, or after that happened.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, first I want to just say for everyone that Nathan's book is excellent. I had the privilege of reviewing it, but I think that they cut out my favorite line, which is that I was reading this on a 6 a.m. flight and was supposed to be sleeping and kept flipping the pages and reading because I was enjoying it so much instead of sleeping on a 6 a.m. flight. So if that is not a ringing endorsement for an entertaining book, I really don't know what is. So I think the editor made me cut that, but it's worth saying to you all. That being said, I think there are some presidents who inherited some pretty spectacular messes. One that comes to mind, which is not the one I was necessarily going to talk about today, but Harry Truman, when he inherited the presidency, FDR had been in office for a very, very, very long time, had really brought the nation through the Great Depression and through most of World War II. But Harry Truman knew nothing, including the fact that there was this little thing called a nuclear weapon that was sort of in process of being finalized. So that was a pretty spectacular mess. The one that I think is perhaps the worst is the one that I was going to talk about today, is the transition between Abraham Lincoln and Andrew Johnson. Now, Abraham Lincoln had ensured the victory in the Civil War, but if it's a civil war, of course, the process of stitching back the nation together into one piece was going to be nearly impossible under the very best of circumstances. And Andrew Johnson was far from the best of circumstances. I think that he is pretty roundly believed to be one of the worst presidents in US history. There's very little argument over that. And I think the transition and the way that it happened made this even worse. So one of the things that I thought was most interesting from the Lincoln chapter in the book that Bill just mentioned was, and it's not something we necessarily think about today because, of course, Easter changes every year, but Lincoln was shot on Good Friday. He died on Saturday, and then Easter was on Sunday. And at a time when the nation was much more religiously observant than we are today, that significance, the fact that he had died for the nation's sins when they were going to church and they were supposed to be celebrating, but they were also mourning, was overwhelmingly powerful. And the shock of it, because this was the first president that had been assassinated, combined with the sort of when it happened in the Civil War, that it was finally almost over and there was victory in sight, and then all of a sudden he was gunned down, made the transition that much more, I think, traumatic. Initially, people, I think, had sort of hope that Johnson actually might be someone who could handle this task well. He was a Southerner. He was the only, if I'm remembering this correctly, he was the only Southern senator that remained loyal to the Union and remained in the Senate. He had then done really well as governor of Tennessee during the war. He'd been a really good wartime governor. And there was a hope that he might do a good job of bringing together the different pieces. And instead, he was a debacle, which, to be fair, maybe people should have known, given that he showed up so intoxicated to his inauguration as vice president that he could barely get through his remarks. And the outgoing vice president had to literally pull him down by his coattails to get him to stop talking. So never a great start when you're beginning your tenure as a vice president, completely wasted. He was a mean man. He was mean. He was angry. He was what we would think of as a toxic personality. He didn't really get along with people. He was terrible at coalition building. He was incredibly racist by the standards of the day. So compared to his contemporaries, he was even worse. And he was vindictive. Now, I think where he had one maybe better than Coolidge is he inherited a fantastic cabinet. The cabinet was incredibly talented, incredibly smart, had served Lincoln very well, but had done so because Lincoln could manage the cabinet. And there were big personalities with big egos and big ideas. And Lincoln was able, through his political genius, to hold that all together. And Johnson failed. I always, when I talk about best and worst cabinets, I always say if your cabinet leads to your impeachment, which Johnson's did, it's never a good sign for your administration. So I think just as a starting point, that's probably a good place to begin with Lincoln and Johnson. And it only got worse from there. Johnson really tried to roll back a lot of the Reconstruction measures, granted clemency to all but the most elite Confederate officers, fought with all of the people both in his party and out of his party in Congress, and was generally hated by the time he left. So, and I think in doing so really set back, who's to say how Reconstruction might have gone differently if Lincoln had been in office, or anyone else for that matter. But I think most people can agree that however Johnson chose to do it, he set back American history and whatever Reconstruction would be for decades.
There's so many questions one can ask about this moment in history, and I know I can't spend all the time on it. And just you mentioned the drunken episode. It's when you dig into this story, it gets weirder and weirder.
It's ridiculous.
Lincoln, was often seen as someone who wanted to heal the divisions after the war, didn't want to be vengeful. And I think I read in Gene Smith's book on the impeachment, and I'm trying to have the book in front of me, so I don't have the quote in front of me, but I believe one of the radical Republicans in the immediate aftermath was pleased that Lincoln was shot, because they thought Johnson would be much harsher towards the Confederate military and not be so lenient in bringing them back in, because he was the reason why he became vice president was that he was seen as, Union first, despite whatever racism and attitude towards slavery he had. Do you think that Johnson's decision to be lenient is all that different from what Lincoln would have done? And if it was similar, would Lincoln just have been better at it because he was a more dignified and politically elegant person?
Well, there's no doubt that he would have been better at it, I think, no matter what. I think it was almost impossible to be worse. But I think that Lincoln drew a distinction between legal leniency or economic leniency. So he wasn't trying to be vengeful, in that he wasn't trying to take everyone's land or imprison everyone or even execute leaders, and a distinction between that approach and restoring the exact same system. What happened when Johnson granted clemency to all of these political and lower level military leaders and allowed the states to come back in rapidly was a recreation of the same state and local governments that had existed prior to the Civil War. And slavery was basically slowly enshrined into the legal system in what we call Jim Crow laws. So slavery itself was illegal, but it became increasingly impossible for emancipated African Americans to vote and participate in the political system. And a number of, whether it was legal mechanisms like poll taxes or special laws about if your grandmother couldn't vote, then you couldn't vote, or violence and intimidation were used to enforce those things. And so what Lincoln was trying to do was not destroy people's ability to live or to support their families, but not to restore their political power, to try and create a political system that was a little bit more equitable, that included African Americans and white Americans in the voting process and the political process. And so it wasn't necessarily harsh, but it was not what Johnson ended up creating.
Let me bring in Professor Gerhardt. Let me just say again, Forgotten Presidents is just a fantastic book. And the subhead is Their Untold Constitutional Legacy. And I'm not aware of anyone else who's tackled this subject, who's not just gone into all these obscure presidents, but really ferreted out their legacies and how the legacies still resonate. So just to start, to get back to Coolidge for the moment, how would you characterize how he handled this abrupt transition, and how did the decisions that he made in the immediate aftermath, how did it change the way American jurisprudence and the American presidency it has been managed?
Well, let me begin by saying thank you for allowing me to be part of this, and thank you for everybody's patience. And as I've learned how to operate the internet,
it's not your fault. Not your fault.
or I should say internets. Sorry. I think the short answer to your question is that Coolidge handled it, at least in my judgment, as well as anybody's ever handled it. He, in some ways, you might even think of him as sort of the, I don't know that we could use this phrase, the gold standard. Even though with almost every situation we're talking about, with presidents dying or being killed, their death was a great surprise to the nation. That was no less true with Harding's death. And yet, Coolidge, I think, had certain qualities that served him well in a circumstance in which was rife with the potential of chaos. Coolidge was not easily ruffled. Coolidge remained sort of relatively sort of centered and grounded and pragmatic. All those things, I think, ended up serving him well, as he not only accepted the mantle, so to speak, of becoming president of the United States, but then he also, as everybody well knows, he took over an administration that was not just rumored, but revelations were being made of relatively widespread corruption at the time, and even more exposure of that as Coolidge's administration went on. And I really think Coolidge managed all of it very well. He was, as I'm sure people have noted and people already know, a man of few words. He took great pride in that. And so he didn't, although he was, I think, the first president to do radio, he was not a president who spent a lot of time going there over the heads of the press, talking to the American people. Instead, he sort of just managed the business of government in a relatively sort of no-nonsense fashion, and the transition was no different. I think Harding was relatively popular. Coolidge in time became, I think, even more popular. And again, that's all the credit to Coolidge. As people got to know him, and not many people did before he became president, I think his popularity grew. And it grew to the point where he probably could have run again had he wanted to. But I see that transition as a relatively smooth one compared to transitions which were absolute disasters.
Actually, a couple of things before I bring it back around to everybody else. And this is somewhat along the same lines of what I asked David. I'm still on my own Coolidge journey, trying to get my head around him. And do you think that he was operating primarily from a place of principle? How do I deal with these scandals in a way that is true to the rule of law? Or was he primarily a political operator? I think, Nathan mentioned, he took his time before he fired Harry Daugherty. And there was this issue whether if he fired Daugherty too soon, that might hurt his ability to keep Ohio in his corner at the 2024 convention. Was he just a really deft player of the game? Or was he primarily principal, or can you not easily separate the two?
I think it's a little hard to separate the two, at least as far as I'm concerned. I think he always tried to remain true to his principles. I think he was a better politician than people, at least since then, have given him credit for. And I think that's one example. I suppose firing Daugherty is better than killing him, which seemed to be the choice between the presidents had, Harding and Coolidge together. But I think that it's easy for us to look back and see that somehow Coolidge handled it well. But he's the first president really in American history to take over an administration that's riddled with corruption. And initially he kind of signals he's going to carry on Harding's policies, but things get complicated very quickly because Coolidge, more than Harding, has got to really deal with this this rather rampant and pervasive corruption, and really kind of invents the idea of let the chips fall where they may. Just, he's going to sign off on the idea of prosecutors and independent counsel, so to speak, at the time that were put forward by Congress, and let them go, kind of follow the money. Let them just do all that stuff. And so that I think was in part political, it's pragmatic, but it was also, I think, an act of principle, because I think Coolidge believed in good government. He believed in, honest government. People could take a great deal of issue with its politics. Franklin Roosevelt is waiting in the wings, especially waiting for Coolidge to fail. He has to wait ultimately for Hoover to be the one to fail. But I think that Coolidge is sort of a less is more kind of guy, both with respect to rhetoric and policy. And that's part of his set of principles that he stays true to.
And quickly, what is the constitutional / legal legacy of his decision to appoint special prosecutors? Had that not been done before? Was that understood at the time to be precedent setting? What's your assessment of that?
I think where it was precedent setting is that Coolidge accepted it. It was not the first time it had happened. In fact, the first time it happened was when Ulysses Grant was president, and Grant proceeded to fire the special prosecutor, which of course was the precedent later that Nixon chose to follow. But Coolidge actually accepted it. And that in itself was quite significant. He allowed for Congress to have a role, which again was, I think, groundbreaking. And there were other things that Coolidge did, I think, that helped establish his legacy, perhaps even more than Harding. He was obviously very focused on trying to sort of scale back government as best he could. However, there were things he did that turned out to be maybe a little surprising. Against his better judgment, he ultimately signs flood disaster relief into law, even though that's a pretty aggressive step for government, especially for somebody like Coolidge who believes government should be smaller and regulate the economy and other things less. But once you do something like sign flood relief into law, what you're really doing is you're saying that's constitutional. And there's a lot of things that come with that, meaning, well, other similar kinds of legislation would have to be permissible as well. He's also breaking new ground in terms of talking on the radio. And therefore making the president more accessible to the American people. I think all those things are quite significant. I won't be quite as critical, I suppose, but just to say that near the end, when, and people may have already mentioned this, when Coolidge is losing some of the taste for the presidency, largely, of course, because of the death of his son, Coolidge is also not, he's kind of firing that engine of the economy so strong that it's going to burn out. And he's not going to see that it's going to burn out. He also, by the way, has such a great team of people around him that cannot be, I think, underestimated. He's got great people in his cabinet for the most part, especially once he gets rid of Daugherty. But there's only one way to go up. So, and he's a pretty wise judge of, okay, the people he should have there, and he kind of lets them do their thing, which turns out to be pretty smart.
Nathan, let me bring you back in here. You just mentioned, Daugherty there. One thing that you mentioned in the book, and I could be mistaken. I mean, I don't know if I've read everything about Teapot Dome in the world. I've read some things. I think you're the first person to suggest that Harry Doherty was in a gay relationship with Jess Smith.
I'm pretty sure I'm
outright.
not.
Okay.
I don't say it outright, but I'm pretty sure I'm not. In fact, you know what? I think I'm blanking on the title, but there was a book about gay Washington that just came out.
Oh,
Somebody
yes,
will know
yes.
the title, and I think
I've
he was
heard
briefly
that.
mentioned in there. There was,
Okay.
yeah. And the truth is, there's no conclusive evidence, which is why I didn't, land squarely on one side. But there was what you would interpret as coded language at the time to describe their relationship. They were, intimate friends, or they were partners in all things. And
They were living together.
They were living together. That's right. They were even sharing, bedrooms. They couldn't sleep without being in each other's company. Yeah.
Let's back up a little bit. Who is Jess Smith?
Yes, yeah, of course. That's a good question. So Jeff Smith was, well, I should say what he's best known for was being found dead almost 100 years ago to this day in the Attorney General's hotel suite at the Wardman Park on Memorial Day, 1923, with a gunshot wound to the head. And it was a pretty suspicious crime scene. His head was found seemingly stuffed into a wastebasket atop burned documents, including Justice Department documents. The first law enforcement officer on the scene was none other than the director of the Bureau of Investigation, William J. Burns, the institution that later became the FBI, and who discouraged a really thorough investigation of the crime scene and essentially pressured the coroner into ruling it a suicide. There were whispers that he was murdered, that Jeff Smith had this reputation as one of these mystery men who wielded influence behind the scenes in Washington. So there was speculation that he had just simply known too much, and that powerful interests had him murdered.
Now, what happened between Harding and Jess Smith in the run-up to his death, to Jess Smith's death?
So what happened?
Between Harding and Jess Smith, wasn't there an issue with him going on the trip to Alaska?
Right. About 3 weeks before Jess Smith's death, Harding had a private conference with Harry Doherty, where he essentially said, yeah, Jess Smith can't come on this trip to Alaska, suggesting that Jess Smith's time in Washington was done. And Smith had been a frequent guest at the White House. He played poker regularly with Harding and Doherty. Doherty and Jess Smith were invited essentially as a couple to White House dinners. But they went on fishing trips together on the president's yacht. But yes, Harding said Smith is out. There seemed to have been an understanding between Harding and Doherty that some scandal was about to emerge that Jess Smith had been wrapped up in. Harding probably knew that Doherty had some involvement in it, but the understanding between the two men was that Smith would be the fall guy. He'd be the scapegoat. And so Doherty told Smith, he basically excommunicated him from his life. Smith had a private office in the Justice Department, even though he was not on the government payroll. He had a private office just off of the Attorney General's office. Doherty said, "You got to get out of the office. You have to move out of our apartment and move back to Ohio." And Smith was shattered. Smith was shattered, of course.
So he's shattered.
Yeah.
He ostensibly kills himself in June of 1923. Harding goes on the trip to Alaska, first by train across the country in July. And on the way back is when he has the heart attack. So was there any whispering in Washington that Coolidge might have been aware of regarding the intimacy of their relationship, or is that just something that has only come to light in the years afterwards?
Again, the sources are sketchy. It was the kind of thing that people just didn't talk about, which makes it really hard for somebody researching it and writing it 100 years later. I would guess, if I'm just speculating here, I'd guess that Coolidge had heard these whispers. They're pretty hard to ignore. And the Senator Wheeler, when he started investigating Doherty, he publicly insinuated that if he wanted to get into Doherty's private life, he could, that there was material there. And I think he was referring to their relationship. Of course, Wheeler did not go there.
Fair enough. I'm going to shift abruptly back to you, Lindsay, off of Coolidge. And I'm going to restrain myself from talking about FDR and Truman, which is a subject I love, because I do want to get to obscure presidents, which I also love. And before the Lincoln Johnson transition, you have the Zachary Taylor Millard Fillmore transition, because Zachary Taylor dies from cholera. And it's in the midst of negotiations around what became the Compromise of 1850. Do you think that Taylor's death and Fillmore's ascension had any bearing on that compromise, and therefore any bearing on how we ended up in a civil war?
Yeah, it's a complicated question. So I do think it had a bearing on it because Taylor had refused in any way to get involved. He had studiously avoided any participation in trying to solve this conflict. And he was really criticized for it, both before his death and after his death, because it was seen as an abdication of presidential responsibility to try not to do something, because everyone recognized that this was a huge growing conflict and it was going to potentially tear the nation apart, and he needed to do something to try and hold it together. And what's interesting about his death is usually sometimes, when we have presidential deaths, people are inclined to kind of gloss over the less flattering details and talk about all the good things. And we've all seen this in our lives too. We'll go to a funeral and people will say really nice things and you'll be like, that's not really the person I knew, but okay. That happens with presidents too. What's interesting about Taylor is that people didn't really do that. They say, well, he didn't have enough time to figure out how to be a good president. He was a great general. He was a really, really great general. And he just didn't have enough time to figure out how to bring that leadership into the Oval Office. But he was a good man, so maybe he would have done so had he really had more time. And so once he died, it was sort of a catalyst to then get this compromise. And I'm loath to ever say anything is inevitable, but I think by 1850 it was pretty clear that both sides had entrenched so significantly that no amount of compromise was really going to solve this problem. And so if anything, the compromise sort of pushed it down the road as opposed to, made it an immediate crisis. So in some ways, I think the impact is that by pushing the crisis down the road, it allowed for there to be a party, the Republican Party, that was willing to push back on slavery as a fracturing issue. And I think that's probably the biggest impact.
So you wouldn't think, is there anything that Taylor might have done different than Fillmore as far as the nature of the compromise itself? What might have been more favorable to the North if Taylor was still around? Was Fillmore too eager to get that compromise, and therefore you get a Fugitive Slave Act, for example?
No, I don't think so, because while Taylor was a Northerner, he owned enslaved individuals and he was very sympathetic to the Southern cause. And was one of the reasons that he had won the presidency when he did, because he was seen as a compromise candidate. He was a Northerner, but he was someone who very much identified with all of the Southern values.
It almost sounds like a bit of a bizarro Kennedy Johnson situation where the Kennedy agenda gets accelerated with Johnson, in that case in favor of civil rights, but in this case things get accelerated towards an entrenchment of slavery.
Yeah, that's kind of an interesting, no one has put it that way. That is a very interesting inversion, kind of a dark dystopian inversion of what came later. I mean, both of them, the thing is, even I sometimes forget like the order of the presidents in the 1840s and the 1850s, because so many of them were so at best unmemorable and at worst bad. And it's because, one, the situation was extraordinarily complex and the issues were not ones that most people could manage. Two, the political parties were quite weak. And so Congress was quite strong and the presidency had very little power. Three, you're coming into a place where there's going to be a civil war. It becomes pretty clear at a certain point, and it requires, I think, the climax of that to shake up the system, but also an extraordinary talent like Lincoln to make it work. And while Lincoln was in no ways perfect, he was an extraordinary talent. And so, Taylor wasn't great. Fillmore wasn't great. There's a reason they're all in the clumping in the bottom of C-SPAN rankings, and we just have to thank them for their service and try and learn from it.
I just want to ask folks, if you have questions, I think what's going to be easiest if you put your questions in the chat, and I'll ask them in a little bit. So another obscure president I really want to get to, which is mentioned in your book, Michael, is just Chester Arthur, who becomes president after James Garfield is assassinated. Can you give a little backstory about the assassination, how Chester Arthur got to be where he was, and what his main legislative legacy followed that?
Sure. So Garfield wins the presidency, as probably most people know, after a really long convention. In some ways, I think people, at least today, think of him more as a dark horse, though he was somebody who had real formidable talents. Garfield was not just sort of been president of college and well-educated. He had been in the House. He had just recently been elected to the Senate. He was a veteran of the Civil War. There are a lot of things that sort of spoke well for Garfield, not the least of which, of course, is that he was from Ohio, which was very helpful in presidential sweepstakes. Well, once Garfield wins the nomination, then it's really left to the convention to determine who's going to be the vice president. And there is a deal, and I'll tell this more swiftly, perhaps, than the story might justify. But there's a deal that's made to appease one part of the Republican Party called the stalwarts. And there were a number of strong personalities on that side, including somebody named Roscoe Conkling, who was from New York, who's truly one of the most colorful figures probably in the 19th century. He's a political boss. He's a lot of different things. And he is incredibly arrogant, incredibly ambitious, and probably quite corrupt. So Conkling was sort of the kingmaker for that sort of part of the party. However, when the deal is being struck, Conkling's not part of it. And instead, there is an effort to draft his political lieutenant, a guy named Chester Arthur, who was really quite possibly the most unlikely character ever to be on a national ticket. Arthur had been just part of a political machine. That is literally what he had been up until that point in his life. His highest office was becoming being in charge of the port of New York, which was really important for federal revenue. Most federal money actually came through the port of New York. It was rife with corruption, and Arthur was quite associated with all of that. So the idea that Arthur was going to be on the ticket was probably a great surprise to a lot of people, perhaps none more so than Conkling. And as the story goes, and I'm never quite sure whether it's true or not, Conkling asked for a meeting with Arthur. Now, Conkling had made Arthur, and Conkling and Arthur's entire political career up until that point was serving Conkling. So Conkling sort of demands a meeting, and they meet in this room, and they think they're alone. Now, it turns out, according to the story, they're not alone. Sitting somewhere in the corner is a reporter hiding behind a newspaper. Now, I have no idea how Conkling and Arthur missed this, but they have a conversation in which Conkling tells Arthur not to take the vice presidency. And Arthur begs to differ. He says, and I paraphrase, this is greater than anything I ever imagined would be possible. So Arthur wants to do it. Conkling doesn't want him to do it.
Why not?
I think partly because it would mean disrupting his coalition, kind of taking, weakening his control of it to some extent, and Conkling doesn't want the Republicans to really have any success if he's not part of it. He's the kind of guy who will, destroy things if they don't go his way. He doesn't want to see other people succeed if he's not the one, being the successor.
Forgive me if I'm interrupting your narrative flow, but
That's
I do want to connect this to Lyndon Johnson.
Yeah.
Because here you have, this is happening about 15 years after the Civil War.
Where
You
no
have-
one's learned any lesson whatsoever about a president dying in office.
Well, yeah, so there's that thing that people are still choosing vice presidents through crassly political reasons.
That's right.
But you have these radical Republicans after Lincoln is assassinated who hope Johnson would hang the Confederates, and he doesn't. They impeach him. What happens between 1867 to 1880, where because Roscoe Kelly was with the radicals, right?
Well, Roscoe Conkling was to some extent with the radicals, but he was also, I think he's mostly interested in Roscoe Conkling. He was not really a person of principle. Ulysses Grant had offered him the Chief Justiceship. I mean, this is a guy who really had been sort of a really powerful player, I think less so with the radical Republicans, more so with sort of the main so-called mainstream, and particularly with the stalwarts. And Conkling's worried at this point, especially given the fact Garfield's won the nomination, that Conkling's star is not rising. It perhaps might be falling. And frankly, he knows Arthur is, and some people said this of Arthur at the time, they called him a creep. He knew Arthur was not going to bring much to the table as vice president. Now, to speed things up, Garfield goes into office. Arthur's kind of a non-entity as he's vice president. And then Garfield is, as we know, he's shot. He's shot by somebody who's basically insane, who has some crazy idea. He deserves some kind of office, but Garfield is wounded, but he's not wounded mortally. The difficulty is the doctors are terrible, and Garfield never recovers, and he gets sicker and sicker because they're bleeding him and they're doing all sorts of things that are actually making him less well. And eventually they kill him. And suddenly Chester Arthur is president of the United States. And what I believe then happens is one of the most remarkable developments in that part of, in that period of American history is that Arthur rises above his background and really tries to be a president of principle and a president who's going to do his best for the American people. That in itself was remarkable. His first meeting as president is with Conkling. We don't quite know what's said because it happened behind closed doors. This time there was not a reporter present. Different rumors. One rumor is that is that Arthur offered him a seat on the Supreme Court. There was a seat available. Conkling was always adept at snatching defeat from the jaws of victory. And so he turned that down. And Arthur proceeds to make an excellent Supreme Court appointment. And before he's done, perhaps his major accomplishment is he will sign into law the first piece of federal legislation creating the civil service, which is remarkable because nobody symbolized patronage more than Arthur. But Arthur brings the civil service into being. And though he's only there for a term and isn't renominated by his party, he actually is quite, I think, reputable as president of the United States. However, one of his last things he does right before he dies is he burns all his papers. So there's no Chester Arthur Library because they're all gone. We could speculate what's in them, but he felt the need to burn them, which gives us some idea they probably weren't terribly flattering. And then, of course, Arthur dies. Arthur had also been friendly with the Roosevelts, in part because he was at Union College at the same time Franklin's father was there. But that is another story.
It does seem like it's a real gamble, because you have this system where you become vice president because through the convention, sometimes the president handpicks, sometimes it's the convention just working its will. But it's often for political reasons, ticket balancing. You have no real job to do. Whether that person meets the moment when the time comes, or is a total utter disaster, seems like a completely random event. Is that a fair characterization?
Yeah, they were. It's. I mean, one thing that struck me, and I just did a biography of Lincoln not too long ago, and then I did the book on the forgotten presidents. So one thing that it struck me is how little people thought about the competency of their vice president, and not really sort of thinking in terms of, oh, I'm going to have somebody who can take over if something happens to me. You know, Lincoln, for all of its greatness, had no interest in hanging around Johnson. He actually says to Johnson, or says to somebody nearby on Inauguration Day, keep him away from me. And I think that's the closest they ever got before Lincoln died. So Johnson was never part of the Lincoln administration. Lincoln never gave a thought that we know of to whether a vice president would succeed him or not. In spite of all those premonitions of death, Lincoln just never made any plans for it. And Taylor, of course, didn't do anything like that. Fillmore was a compromise candidate to kind of help balance out that ticket. And Arthur was the same thing. But Arthur, I think, is quite surprising because everybody expected he would just be a complete failure, but he was basically like an average president, which was quite an achievement for somebody for whom nobody had any expectations at all.
We have some questions in the queue here. One from Stephen. Now, Winch said Ford had difficult transition after all the Nixon problems. Here's the one example of someone who ascended for vice president without there being a death. For any one of the three you want to jump at this, we talked about Coolidge being dealt with this massive plate of scandals. Here's a case where the president resigns because of scandal. Did Ford have it as hard as Coolidge, or was it easier because the problem had already taken some ownership of it and walked out the door?
I mean, I can jump in first.
Sure, go for
it. I think if Ford was in a tough position, I don't know if it might have technically been. In some ways, it was easier than what Coolidge faced and harder. It was easier in the sense that there had been lots of revelations before Ford became president. A lot more was known about the corruption. There were a lot more prosecutions, indictments, convictions by the time Ford ends up in office. A lot more than happened with Coolidge. So in that sense, Ford had a better idea of just what the landscape had been. It was harder in the sense that the corruption in the Nixon administration went all the way to the top. Now we don't know about Harding's involvement. No, and Harding having died was in a sense kind of nobody really bothered much figuring out what Harding knew and when he knew it. But with Ford, the fact that Nixon himself had to resign because of scandal, that put Ford in an immensely difficult position And there were rumors that the deal that put Ford in the White House was made in exchange for a pardon. And of course, we all know Ford then pardoned him for the sake of trying to heal the country. But that pardon, I believe, was made in good faith by Ford, whose integrity, I think, before, during, and after all this has been really pretty strong and unassailable. But Ford made that deal thinking it was going to be for the best. It backfired, and it was one of the reasons he wasn't elected.
Question from Donald asking Dr. Travinsky to talk more about the FDR-Truman transition. I read they weren't close and that the party bosses essentially pushed out the incumbent VP Henry Wallace at the 1944 convention.
Yes, very much not close at all. They barely spoke. I think they had lunch once or twice. Truman, which, you know, some of these other circumstances, it's a little bit, well, let me back up by saying, I think that vice presidents are almost always selected for electoral purposes and not as a governing partner, with perhaps very, very few exceptions. And certainly that was true for Truman, certainly that was true for Johnson, certainly that was true for a lot of the different people we've been talking about. And it's a little bit more understandable if you have someone like Garfield or Lincoln that are healthy and young men. Garfield was apparently like quite a physical specimen. He was like big and burly and like a really good athlete. So, you know, like you don't expect someone to die. It's a little bit different when it's FDR, who there's some controversy over how much he knew about his heart condition, but he clearly knew he was not in good health. He did not choose to have a public inauguration celebration for the fourth term. He was all because he didn't want to stand anymore because it was too physically painful. And he was, you know, so in such poor health that he ended up having to go to Georgia for a while after his trip to Yalta to try and recover. And so the selection of someone who you didn't know and you didn't really talk to, and then you especially didn't talk to after they were inaugurated, makes a little bit less sense when I think he kind of believed he wasn't going to live out the term. And so therefore the lack of communication, the lack of, you know, bringing this person into the fold and trying to share with them what they were going to face is a little bit less understandable.
One thing that I don't understand about the Wallace-Truman thing is that FDR went out on a limb for Wallace 4 years prior. He was sort of considered very left. People in Washington thought he was a kook and too close to the Russians. And so I get that the insiders wanted to get him out because they were worried he was going to become president in the near term. But why did FDR acquiesce to that if he was so committed to having Wallace there 4 years prior?
I think it all is about like when this is taking place and what is taking place in the context of the global atmosphere. At this point, the war was clearly sort of coming to an end, even though it wasn't over yet. It was coming to an end, and he was trying to stave off, I think, challenges from both his left and right flank, and also the isolationist flanks in both parties. He wanted the United States to continue to maintain its cooperation in the international community, and so was fighting off those impulses, I think, on both sides. And that's why Truman was an appealing option. Although anyone who's read anything in FDR knows that when FDR doesn't want people to know what he's thinking, he doesn't tell anyone what he's thinking. He can very much be an enigma. Even though, you know, more of his papers survive, he really kept things close to the vest. And a lot of people felt like they knew him really well, but also not at all.
I happen to have done a podcast about Edward Stettinius, who was FDR's last Secretary of State and Truman's first, and his role in creating the United Nations. I'm just curious to hear what you think. We talk about Chester Arthur stepping up. You know, Truman was not considered to be a man of great heft of intellectual thought, and you know, Truman FDR dies. Truman's not expecting. He's playing cards in the Senate. He's ushered over. He's told this by Eleanor, and Stettinius tells him, "You have to decide: are we going forward with having the San Francisco conference to ratify the UN Charter. There was an open question because there was some tension with Stalin at that point. I'm just curious if you have an opinion about how Truman handled that moment.
Well, there's another question in the chat from Tim about basically this exact question of in the last decade, Truman has received a lot more recognition for what he did. And I think that it's warranted and appropriate. He was a good man. He was a decent man. He was tasked with a really crappy hand. And Eleanor said as much when he came to see her. He said, I'm so sorry. And she said, oh, no, like, we're sorry for you now because you're the one that is going to need the good wishes. And stepped up to deal with a very complex international relationship with Stalin and Churchill and de Gaulle and the end of the war and really impossible moral choices regarding Japan and nuclear weapons. And then trying to put together that process afterwards and dealing with some very unruly generals and threats to civilian authority and the creation of the UN, and really, I think handled it pretty remarkably given his lack of experience and how little he knew prior coming into office.
You reference, Tim's question here. Doesn't Coolidge deserve more recognition, similar to the resurrection of Truman in the 70s and 80s, because of the things we were talking about today, the way he handled the Harding situation very elegantly. Obviously, Coolidge is a very difficult figure to get your head around because there's stuff like the immigration bill, which is highly controversial, that often characterized as racist. But there's also the Native American Citizenship Act, where you bestow citizenship on all Native Americans. So the Coolidge legacy is always something that's going to be hotly debated because there's different parts of it you can take, but leave it open to the group here. Maybe I'll start with you, Nathan. You haven't been in it a bit. Again, you weren't a Coolidge expert walking into this project. Did you have a perception of him at all when you started, and did it change at all over the course of your research?
My perception of him started out pretty limited. Like I knew that he slept a lot, that he liked to nap in the middle of the day, and I knew about his politics, but yeah, my understanding of him really deepened, and as I mentioned earlier, I came to admire him in a way that really surprised me. Just admiring his conviction, his how he really put principle over, in some cases, over his own political well-being. It's something that we don't see a lot of in Washington politics today.
Yeah, outside of immigration is often talked about as one of his worst aspects of his legacy. I think growing up, since we weren't doing a lot of looking back on race as much, in my childhood, he was often just talked about as the guy who had his eye off the ball before the Great Depression. Did not have the foresight to realize the speck of the bubble was occurring. Let's ask you, Michael. Is that a fair knock, that he should be criticized for his handling of the economy, or is it unfair because no one could have known that was around the bend?
Well, I think that there were some people that claimed to know. I mean, let me just disclose that I've just finished a draft of a biography of FDR I'm writing. So I've been somewhat inundated with that and living in that world. And one of the things that Woodrow Wilson says to FDR is, and it's near the end of the Wilson administration, that people will only elect Democrats when there's a crisis or something bad is happening. And so that's a paraphrase, and so
Arguably still true.
Arguably still true. And therefore, when Coolidge is, we all know this, but Harding and Coolidge, of course, beat a ticket that has Franklin Roosevelt as the VP candidate. So Roosevelt is watching them pretty carefully. Although he's, of course, building his own career in New York. And of course, then he has his own great challenge with polio. But one of the things that Roosevelt believes is the bottom is going to drop out. And there are economists who are telling him that, but he thinks it's not going to happen until about 1936. It just happens faster than he expected. And in a sense, Coolidge will have to take some of the responsibility for the fact that when the economy goes down, it really goes down. And it goes down obviously under Hoover, but the signs are there that are suggesting that things are becoming overheated. There are a lot of other complications that arise. And so I think I don't think Coolidge is unmindful of it all, but I don't think he cares. Hoover even tries to enlist Coolidge during Hoover's first run for the presidency, and Coolidge doesn't want anything to do with it. Coolidge basically says no. So he's kind of checked out of government. And I think that is kind of, it puts some burden on Coolidge, I think, for having to take some of the responsibility for when that bottom does fall out. But once Roosevelt runs, he's obviously running not against Coolidge, he's running against Hoover, and that's a whole other sort of thing we could talk about. But it's and their relationship, by the way, degrades quite quickly as well. So by the time Roosevelt comes into office, he never really is a Coolidge fan. He's definitely not a Hoover fan. And they're going to adopt the exact opposite economic policies.
Do you have a sense that Coolidge had a strong economic philosophy going into being vice president as president, that he stuck to all the way through, or what? Or did presidents not really have that? It wasn't expected that you'd have an economic philosophy, and therefore he's more making it up as he goes along, influenced by the Treasury Secretary Andrew Mellon. What's your sense of how deeply he felt these economic principles were?
It's a really good question. I think he had one more than most. And I think you're right that a lot of presidents may not have come in with much of an economic policy, but if you look at Wilson and you look at even Taft and you look at the presidents that sort of precede Roosevelt, they're all mindful of the economy. They all have some thoughts about it. And so I think it's fair to say that when he was governor of Vermont, Coolidge had sort of developed a political and economic philosophy, particularly when he gets to Washington. He's famous for thinking that what's good for business is going to be good for America. And therefore, when Roosevelt comes into office, Roosevelt is positioning himself almost the opposite of Coolidge and Hoover. Roosevelt is viewed as an enemy of business, particularly big business. I don't think Roosevelt was mentally that or conceptually that, but he was much more suspicious of business and less inclined to just let it run its however it liked than either Hoover or Coolidge. So there was a lot of sort of thinking about the economy. The other problem with all of it is, of course, a lot of that thinking was defective. They weren't sophisticated economists, and so their thinking was relatively antiquated and somewhat flawed, and they had to kind of, and that didn't help, of course.
I know Dr. Travinsky has to run soon. I apologize, everybody, because I know we started later than expected, and I don't think I gave anybody a proper introduction in the first place. But so Lindsay, can you just tell us a little bit more about your presidential historical background, where people can find your work, and if you have any last thoughts just about, because again, you wrote this great book, you edited this great book, Mourning the Presidents. Is there a through line about mourning that you knew going into the project or developed over the course of the project that you wanted to share with us?
Sure. Well, thank you again for having me. I'm sorry that we had some technological difficulties to start, and I appreciate everyone hanging in there while we figured it out. My first book was on the creation of the president's cabinet, and I never really intended to set out to be a presidential historian. I was an early American historian by training. And then I became convinced that the best way to understand a presidency was through the lens of a cabinet. I think it reveals, as we've discussed today with so many of these presidents, it really reveals a whole lot about who they were, what were their strengths, their weaknesses, how they managed the people around them, and all the big stuff, whether it's legislation or war or foreign or domestic policy. It all goes through the cabinet one way or another. And then I just sort of started expanding out from there. And that has led me to sort of do this presidential history thing. I would welcome all of you to go to my website, which is lindsaychervinsky.com. All my stuff is there. You can also sign up for my newsletter, which is once a month. I never spam people. It's an essay about a historical subject and then has all the links to podcasts, events like this one, anything else that I'm up to. So it's a great way to sort of stay on top of things. My through line with this book is, as I was looking through, as we were putting together these chapters of all the different presidents, and there are 12 of them, from George Washington to George H.W. Bush, the process of mourning and commemoration in history is never static. It is constantly evolving. It is constantly changing, whether that's because of technological innovation like railroads or the telegraph or social media. The process is moving, and how Americans respond to these things, what they make of a presidential death, is very unique depending on that moment in history. And it often says a lot more about that moment than it does about the president or what the president's legacy is. And I think that's good and right and makes sense, because we as a nation continue to change and evolve. But what I would challenge people then to think about is, what should the process of mourning be? How should we treat former presidents or presidents that die in office? And what do we want our values and our culture to be reflected in that particular moment? And so I think for me, it was a really good challenge to think about, this is what has been done in the past. How do we want to do things in the future? And I hope that this conversation amongst all of us about all these different things has provoked some thought in that area.
Well, thank you so much, Dr. Chervinsky. You were fantastic. Thank you for being patient with me. I want to get back to Nathan and Michael one last time as well. If anyone has a last question, please get that in the chat right now. Michael, let me ask you. One of the legacies of Coolidge that you mentioned in the book is foreign policy and the Kellogg-Briand Act. It's one of those things that I think, when you think of Coolidge as this big sort of uber conservative who didn't want to touch the economy, didn't want to give the Wall Streeters a hard time, crack down immigration, yet he tries to do this big peace pact after Harding wins, opposing Woodrow Wilson's League of Nations. What's your sense of how he got from that point A to point B? Did he have a foreign policy vision going in that he wanted to carry out, or is this improvisational because the Republican Party is sort of feeling its way on the global stage in the aftermath of the Great War?
I think it's more the latter. One thing I will give a little bit of credit to President Coolidge in this regard. He was not, he wasn't perfect, and he could be stubborn and narrow-minded. But one of the things that sometimes distinguishes a president is the extent to which they're educable. And I think Coolidge was educable with regard to foreign affairs. He had the benefit of having a terrific Secretary of State. And so I think that he probably didn't have any hardcore views until he really got into the position of being vice president and ultimately president. And once there, I think then there were opportunities that arose in the world that that his administration, particularly again his Secretary of State, was able to sort of try and take advantage of, try and work with, and Coolidge gets some credit for all that.
And let me ask you, Nathan, where does Coolidge land with all of these scandals? He has a special prosecutor. He eventually fires Harry Doherty. You know, by the end of his presidency, are all these matters seen as resolved favorably, or are there loose ends?
Well, certainly a lot of the principals in these scandals never really received proper justice, right? In the case of the Teapot Dome scandal, Albert Fall, the Interior Secretary, actually went to prison, and I believe he was the first former cabinet secretary to be sentenced to prison. But the two oil men involved, Harry Sinclair and Edward Doheny, they escaped prison time. In the case of Harry Doherty was actually put on trial by his successors, who vigorously pursued the case. The U.S. attorney for the Southern District of New York prosecuted. The first trial ended in a hung jury, and they tried it again. And again, the trial ended in a hung jury. There was one holdout that prevented Harry Doherty from going to prison, because there was conclusive evidence found that Doherty had accepted bribes in return for official favors. So in a sense, it was never resolved. And I should also mention that, of course, the litigation surrounding Teapot Dome and the Doherty case went all the way, I think, to 1927, right? I think that's when the Supreme Court finally issued its ruling in those cases. So it dragged on, but in a sense, it was never finished.
Well, I just want to reiterate, I love all these books. I really recommend if these are your next three books, The Forgotten Presidents, Mourning the Presidents, and Crooked, you are just going to know like a billion times more about American history than you did before you started. So thank you all for being part of this. Thank you all for your patience and letting us get through our technological hiccups. This is the first event that the Coolidge Library is doing to start commemorating the Coolidge centennial. It is 100 years as of August 3rd, when his presidency begins. We are planning to do more events over the course of the next several years. Our next one is going to be more of a social event here at the Coolidge Library in Northampton, Massachusetts, on July 29th. It's a Saturday at 2 p.m. It's going to be an outdoor event. Unless it rains, we'll move inside. We're going to have music. We're going to serve pies, Calvin and Grace Coolidge's favorite pies. Some short remarks about the swearing in, and we're going to debut a new biographical film on Coolidge as well. And then we got ideas for 1924, because 1924 is the Immigration Act, it's the Native American Citizenship Act, it's the election, which has a lot of civil rights elements to it. It's the night the Democrats have the so-called Klan Bake Convention, where the KKK disrupts that convention, and Coolidge has to navigate those civil rights issues as well. So there's a lot of 100th anniversary things to talk about in 1924 that we want to get to. So please stay in touch with us, and we'll get on the Forbes Library email list so you get kept appraised of what we're going to do next. And just thank you so much for being part of this.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Take care, everybody.
Thank you.
Take care.
Great job, Bill.